Governor laying out her plans for New York, saying, quote, the state of the state is strong. We're going to break down some of the biggest proposals and reactions to that address as the legislative year kicks off officially here in Albany. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson here in Albany. The governor laying out her goals for this legislative session over this past week in that first State of the State address since she was elected to the full term. Governor proposing a $36 million investment in the state's gun violence initiative known as GIVE, saying her number one priority, of course, is keeping all New Yorkers safe. Additionally, the state's mental health system could be getting a significant boost if a proposed billion-dollar multi-year investment is approved. The governor also plans to support the New York Housing Compact's goal of building 800,000 new homes over the next decade.
I'm proud to stand here and say that the state of our state is strong, but we have work to do.
Joining us now to discuss the key points from the State of the State address, we have Grant Reher, professor of political science at Syracuse University. Professor, Happy New Year. Welcome back. Nice to see you.
It's good to see you, and Happy New Year to you.
Thank you very much. So let's talk about the State of the State here. First and foremost, one of the things at the very beginning we usually see an applause line when the president or governor, whatever the case may be, says the State of the State is strong. It was awfully quiet in that assembly chamber this year, which kind of made me chuckle. But the governor seemed to deliver some points that both parties can agree on, even though, as we know, the Democrats, remain to have that stranglehold here on the Capitol.
Right. I think, one of the things that clearly struck me from the outset is this speech was a response in a lot of ways to the very close election that she went through.
Sure.
And so there were some important things that were said about crime and safety and also affordability that were clearly meant to be directed toward some of the biggest hits that she took during the campaign. And we can talk more about some of those things. But then there were also some things that she was putting forward that would be of appeal to the progressives, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which is most of the Democratic Party in New York State. And so there were a bunch of specific things there. And of course, looming over all of this is the conflict, as you already mentioned, that she's having over the appointment of the appellate court justice.
And one of the biggest things, of course, that the Republicans were really hammering during the campaign was crime and crime rates here in the state of New York. And of course, asking for that reform of bail reform laws. She did make, I felt, as you pointed out too, some concessions in that by saying she felt she was open to coming together, working together to make changes to it.
Right. So she's proposing more discretion on the part of judges, and in particular, certain kinds of accused crimes, and looking at the accused suspect. So if that person has a history, for example, with committing, and I think this was an important piece, committing crimes with a gun, that's something that can be factored into in deciding about not only whether to use bail, but how much that bail should be. And then there's a criterion in setting bail about that is currently in place, is to use the minimum that is necessary, minimum restraint necessary. And she was also proposing to relax that for certain kinds of cases. And so those are two pretty major changes to the status quo.
And speaking of judges, and you touched on it briefly just a second ago too, her nominee for the New York State Court of Appeals, Judge Hector LaSalle, and there's even been a lot of Democratic voices speaking up now saying that they're not too keen on him, but the governor seems to be standing her ground here.
Right, and so this person is a former prosecutor. I think that was something that raised a lot of progressive hackles. Also, and here, it's always a murky business to try to predict the future based on the evidence that you've got in the past with judges, but there are some decisions that were fairly narrowly made that would suggest that this person's going to be as conservative as the person that he'll be replacing. And so that's the concern on one side. On the other side, a big value for Governor Hochul and for the Democrats in recent years is diversity. And this person speaks to that concern. And so it's an interesting pick in that way because it speaks to kind of both sides of the concerns here around crime and safety and policing.
One of the other big things the governor mentioned, she said income tax would not be raised this year. A lot of Republicans say that's not enough, and they've been citing the numbers of people fleeing the state. And, once again, pounding some of those mandates and laws that have become too restrictive here.
Right. So, yes, she announced no new taxes, in essence, but at the same time, there wasn't really anything in the state of the state which would indicate that she's going to try to turn Battleship New York around when it comes to the fact that it is either one of the most or the most heavily tax-burdened states in the country. And so that's going to be something that the Republicans focus on. I think she also tried to get at this issue, though, through another avenue, and that was the question of affordable housing, because that is one of the reasons why some people are leaving the state of New York. And so she did promise and propose quite a large investment in that. Now, the other side of the coin on that, which is going to rankle some of the progressives, is one of the mechanisms that she is proposing to increase the affordable housing stock are tax breaks for developers. And so that is something that is always a tough sell among the left of the party.
And finally, one of the big pushes here, of course, as we look at the environment and climate change, is this big push to go all electric. And of course, one of the biggest concerns coming out of the Republican Party is, how do you pay for it? Can the grid sustain an all electric community here? And of course, the biggest push now is seemingly this attack on gas appliances and gas stoves.
Yeah, I think that's going to be rethought and probably walked back, because for a lot of different reasons. But one is you've got a lot of folks that are serious about their cooking. And there's a huge difference, as any serious cook knows, between a gas stove and an electric range when you're trying to cook things on a stovetop. And so that's going to be one factor. But I think also, more generally, there's concerns about cost. How will this affect the per unit cost of electricity? There are some neighboring states to New York. Hard to believe that the per unit cost of electricity is higher than it is here. And so, that's something that's going to have to get worked out. There's something we haven't discussed, and I don't know if we have time to do this, but there was one big thing that surprised me about this State of the Union address at a kind of a conceptual level. Yeah, I was surprised that relatively little of it was framed and addressed toward upstate New York. It really had a downstate flavor in a lot of respects, particularly with the specific examples and where a lot of this money is going to be directed. I found that surprising because upstate was where she really got hammered in the election. And she is from upstate. And I think there are possibilities for her to strengthen her appeal in upstate New York. But I didn't see a lot of effort to do that in this State of the State address. And I have to say that frankly puzzled me. I walked away from it scratching my head a little bit about that.
Well, and I think that was a big knock on Andrew Cuomo a lot of the time, too, was it not?
Oh, yeah, and he's a downstater. And so, guy from Queens and rarely went upstate. He liked to have his office there in New York City and live in the mansion there in Albany. I guess that's upstate by some considerations, but there's a debate about that, but a little island there of Albany. But yeah, and you'd think that there would be some lessons learned there, but in particular, her election being so close, and you look at the patterns of where she took the biggest hits and why, you would really have thought that this would have been a moment to try to shift gears a little bit and redirect more attention there.
And it will certainly be a year to watch for sure. Professor Grant Rare, Political Science Department there at Syracuse University, thank you as always for your time. Nice to see you.
Good to see you, and always enjoy the conversations. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, sir. The pandemic continues to have an impact on many students' learning. Hear from an education expert who says a new proposal could help those students make up for the time and learning lost due to COVID. Well, welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson here in Albany. Keeping with the proposals coming out of that State of the State address, education is set to get a significant investment to aid in making up for pandemic-era learning losses. proposed education agenda would bring an additional $2 billion towards foundation aid, which allocates state funding to the schools. Additional investments will bring pre-kindergarten education to over 17,000 more children across New York and create new tutoring programs to assist students still dealing with that pandemic learning impact and loss. To talk more about the state and education spending, we're joined now by Bob Schneider, the Executive Director for the State School Boards Association. Bob, nice to see you. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, Ryan.
So first of all, let's just get your thoughts on what you heard following the State of the State address. Did you like what the governor had to say when it comes to education around the state?
We do like what we heard from Governor Hochul in her proposed budget for funding public education. There's a $2.7 billion increase, which represents a 13% increase. A lot of that is in the foundation aid, which is the large aid category that funds school districts. It's the operational aid in order for school districts to run the districts throughout the year. 13% is good. We're thrilled about that. It's the third installment on the restoration of the foundation aid that was due school districts from years ago. So it looks good as a proposal. We're going to see what happens when the legislature puts their budget forward and the negotiations start in a few weeks.
And for those who are not fully familiar with the foundation aid, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that goes out, that's needs-based, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a formula behind it, very complex. We would need hours for me to explain it to you, or anybody else, and somebody would have to explain it to me. But it's needs-based. It's a formula that needs some updating, and we're hoping, if not this year, or at least this year, we start looking at that foundation aid formula and update it with data, new, current needs, demographics in new communities. It started in 2007, and I think some of the information is old data, so we have to get that updated. But first and foremost, get that funding into the budget, which was proposed by the governor.
And not only that, but increased funding for pre-K programs as well. And I know there's a lot of families out there to like what that will result in if it goes through.
Absolutely, that's important. The governor's proposal is about it doubles the amount that was in the budget last year, and that would result in 95% of 4-year-olds having access to pre-K around the state. And that is so important if you think about it. You get the students into school, in the schooling environment before they get to kindergarten, and they can learn important things, socializing, basic reading skills, and it really is a cost saver in the long run because you've got these students earlier. You don't have to worry about remediation when they get up into the higher grades, and they didn't have that opportunity to prepare for kindergarten. So we're thrilled, and 95%, as the governor said yesterday, as far as 4-year-olds that have access is great around the state, and we're shooting for 100% eventually, and hope we can get there.
As we come out of the pandemic over the past few years, there's been a lot of talk about mental health and the effect that had on our students. Of course, the governor also proposing some additional funding to create some school-based mental health clinics.
Yeah, that is so important. I took this job 3 years ago, right before the pandemic hit, and there was a superintendent survey from the Council of School Superintendents saying that one of the priorities and issues in the school setting was student mental health issues. Fast forward 3 years later through a pandemic, and you can imagine what our schools are dealing with as far as students with mental health issues or behavioral issues. It is so important to get the supports around these students when they're in the school system, the guidance counselors, the psychologists. So, that's important, and we know we can use that money to get those resources to help those students, because let's face it, if you have a mental health issue, you're in trauma, say, as a student, it's going to be tough to learn in the classroom environment. So we're all about that. One thing we do have a concern about is finding staffing. There is a shortage of these professional health counselors, not only in this state, but countrywide. And we've got to develop a pipeline and come up with creative ways to work with our counties, to work with private firms, to get those supports into those students during the day.
And speaking of staffing, that makes me think of buses and bus drivers. And I didn't hear anything specific in her remarks about that. But what are you thinking about that moving forward as we look forward to the next school year, as it's still a big issue for a lot of districts around the state?
Yes, busing is a big issue, and I know the governor, before she was elected last year, she passed some. There was some steps that she put forward to encourage more people to become bus drivers, get the license they need more quickly, that type of thing. That's paying off, but we still have that issue. So we didn't see anything specific in the detail of the state of the state. Hopefully, maybe we'll see something in the final budget. But I know Governor Hochul had jumped on that very quickly before she got elected, because this is a problem. It's an ongoing problem. But she gave districts more flexibility as far as trying to get bus drivers in play. We have a shortage of them, as you said. We have a shortage of diverse teachers and teachers overall. So we've got to really look at the short term, how we can get more people involved in staffing, but then the long term pipeline, how do we develop that?
And Bob, lastly, I want to get your thoughts on this. I think more affects families out there in these districts, especially the more rural ones, and that's tying minimum wage, the proposal to tie minimum wage to inflation.
Mm-hmm. Well, we didn't, that is something we didn't really focus in on yesterday with the state of the state, the detailed document. We really focused in only on the public education issues.
Sure.
So I wouldn't feel comfortable speaking to that. I will say one of the things that we didn't see, and we hope the governor will consider this, is including the universal meals in the
Yes.
budget. Hopefully the legislature will put that through. That's an important issue. Right along with minimum wage, food is expensive. We talked about inflation on some of my other interviews. And, there's a lot of families that are having a tough time affording food with inflation. So we focus and we hope we can go back to the universal meals program where all students have access to meals while in school. Since June, we've gone back to the free and reduced model where students qualify for meals based on economic background and other factors. But once again, cost of food is rising. So that's something we focused in on. Minimum wage somewhat ties in as far as affordability, I guess, but we did not focus in on that.
And when you talk about the food too, I know there was some talk in the address about tapping into more of the local farms around the state and having
Yes.
schools buy more of the local food and making those more nutritious
Yes.
meals available.
And that's important. And I think not only from that perspective, you go farm to school cafeteria table. I think there's an opportunity for learning for these students. They can get out there to
Yeah.
those close farms and do activities, educational programs, things like that. So we're for that also.
Bob Schneider from the New York State School Boards Association. Bob, nice to chat with you. Good to see you. Thanks again.
Thank you, Ryan. Take care. Bye-bye.
Additional changes could be coming to a controversial policy. The governor saying she is open to reforming bail reform laws. Hear from lawmakers on what they'd like to see changed. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson here in Albany. Bail reform, controversial issue all over the state. Governor spoke about it in that State of the State address. Capitol correspondent Jamie DeLine speaking with some lawmakers to get their reaction to the speech and what they think needs to be done.
In her State of the State address, Governor Hochul mentioned bail reform, something Republicans and Democrats haven't been able to see eye to eye on.
But I believe there are several things we can agree upon. First, that the size of someone's bank account should not determine whether or not they sit in jail or go home, even before they've been convicted of a crime.
Hochul went on to say that bail reform is not the cause of a national increase in crime, but rather other factors have played a role, including the pandemic. Even though she supports bail reform, Hochul says the law, as written, leaves room for improvement and wants to discuss changes with lawmakers during the budget process.
We also have to make sure the law is clear for our judges and what their rights are and what their expectations are.
Republican Senator Jim Tedisco has been calling for changes to the law for years and has a bill that aims to get rid of cash bail.
I appreciate the governor once again saying they're going to reform the reform of the reform of the reform. But we've heard the rhetoric. We need the action now. And if it does take place, I'll be the first one to support it. real discretion for judges at a reasonable level.
Democratic Assembly member Latrice Walker has been a big supporter of bail reform. While she said she appreciated the governor sharing the initial intent of the law, she states, quote, "I cannot, however, abide by changes to state law that would eliminate the federal least restrictive means standard for bail-eligible cases. The Supreme Court has clearly established in United States v. Salerno that if a prosecutor's only interest is in preventing flight, bail must be set by a court at a sum designed to ensure that goal and no more." Reporting in Albany, I'm Jamie DeLine.
Thanks to Jamie. All right, stick around. We'll be right back with a look at the week ahead in just a moment. All right, and finally from us here on Empire State Weekly, we continue to follow the impacts of Governor Hochul's proposals coming out of the State of the State. One proposed plan could help families struggling with high prices, as it would tie New York's minimum wage to inflation. Governor's plan argues indexing the minimum wage to inflation would maintain the purchasing power of workers' wages year to year. Next week, we'll speak with an economic expert on the possible impacts of that very policy, so you're going to want to stay tuned for that. For now, from all of us here on Empire State Weekly, I'm Ryan Peterson in Albany. I'll see you back here next week. Don't forget, you can catch Empire State Weekly all over New York. Here's our full schedule, 10 television stations across the state.